This video explains some techniques to use while watercolor painting, specifically a landscape. Once you have your selected photo and have blocked in the outlines very lightly on the paper, you can start painting. Here I selected a photo I took while kayaking in the summer. Depending on the type of paper you use, you may want to tape or staple the paper onto the board. In this video, I used painter's tape. Notice how I taped one side down and then that side's opposite. There is another video about stretching watercolor paper that uses watercolor tape, which is probably the best method for stretching watercolor paper. Watercolor paper needs to be stretched so that the paper warps or wrinkles less when water is applied. When stretched properly, the paper shouldn't warp at all. I already had paint mixed in trays from another painting I was working on at the same time, so this video doesn't show much about mixing paint colors. I often suggest painting the background of a composition first so you don't have to rework the edges of objects when working on the main subject of a piece. In a way, I do this by starting with the lily pads. Part of the reason I didn't start with the water is that the color is such a dark blue-green that if I made a mistake, it would have been hard to fix the lily pads later. Notice how I wet the paper first and then applied a light layer of green to each lily pad. The reason for adding the water first was to get a smooth value transition with the watercolor. I also used a large brush so when I applied paint or water, the color would blend more quickly. This does take practice, which is why you should practice different techniques before you try to create a final painting. You can obtain smooth transitions with dry paper, but one must work very quickly to do that before the paper absorbs all the water. Creating wet-on-wet transitions is a little more relaxed a workflow. I continued to use a variety of greens in the lily pad until I was satisfied with the color, using the photo I took while kayaking as a reference for the color choices. I also used several greens, so there was a variety of color in each lily pad. In order to speed the process of painting, I also used a hairdryer to dry the lily pads before moving on to painting the water. I needed to make sure the edges of the lily pads were dry before starting the water so that the dark blue-green from the water didn't bleed into the yellow-green of the lily pads. I also put new water in the cup that I rinsed my brushes in so it wasn't contaminated with the green from the lily pads. I adjusted the color in my palette to create a really deep blue-green by adding more of each color to the palette. This dark color was necessary to create the contrast I needed between the lily pads and the water. As I let the larger blue-green area dry, I added the blue-green watercolor to the smaller areas in the painting to create contrast between the lily pad green and the blue-green of the water. I noticed that the color was more green at first and eventually added more blue to my palette as I continued to paint the smaller water areas. I also added more of this color to the larger water area to keep the painting unified. Hopefully you noticed that I painted these areas with a smaller brush than what was used for the larger areas in the painting. You should always use a similar sized brush for the job that you are doing when you're painting anything. As the water was drying, I used yellow to paint the inside of the lily with a much smaller brush than any I had previously used. I could paint this area because the petals of the lily were dry. I hope you realize that after I paint one area, I either wait for that area to dry before painting again or help the area to dry by using the hairdryer. After the yellow was applied to the middle of the flower, I added more greens to the lily pads. I also painted a star or asterisk pattern inside the lily pads as I noticed that growth pattern in the lily pads of my reference photo. I also added another layer of blue-green to the water. Both of these things were done to create more contrast between each object in the painting. I did this carefully in order to keep the edges between the areas crisp and focused. Once those areas were dry, I watered down the yellow-green I used for the lily pads and started adding very light layers of yellow-green to the lily. Notice that I had a paper towel in my other hand and used that to remove some of the color as I worked on the petals. I wanted to make sure the flower and reflections stayed very light, and removing some of the watercolor in this manner helped accomplish that. I made sure to stay away from the edges of the petal so the color didn't bleed from one petal to another. This allowed me to keep areas of the petals completely white. After I finished the yellow-green in the actual flower, I switched to the blue-green color I used in the water to create the reflection. Although I did water down the color in order to keep the reflection of the lily looking more white than the water around it. Remember, reflection should be slightly darker than the object in real life. Once the reflection in the water had a layer of blue-green on it, I then added a very light layer of blue-green to the lily itself, again to help unify the painting. Once I had a base value on the lily and reflection, I noticed that the petals of my lily were too pointed compared to the lily in the reference photo. To fix this, I used both the greens of the lily pads and the blues of the water to attempt rounding the petals. Notice that as I did this, I also blended the color into the larger area by using a little more water on the brush to smooth out the color I used around the petals. Once I felt I did a good enough job on that, I added another light layer of blue-green to the lily, applying more color to the most shadowed area and blending the color out by using a little bit more water as I continued to paint the petals. Occasionally, I would blot the moisture with the paper towel in an attempt to control the paint. One of the last things I did was to add a little of the watered down blue-green to the yellow in the center of the lily. I did this to create a greater contrast between the center of the lily and the petals in the foreground, since there isn't much contrast difference between yellow and white. The last part of the painting I worked on was the lily pads. The reason for this is that I noticed there wasn't enough blue-green in the left lily pad closest to the flower. When I felt like the painting was complete, I removed the tape, pulling the tape away from the painting so that if the paper ripped, it pulled away from the painting rather than into it to prevent rips in the painting itself. This is one way to work with watercolor and should help you not only create a landscape but give you tips on how to work with watercolor as an art media as well.